I'm Linda Viscardis, and this is a fireside chat without the fireside with Mr. Cormac Russell, and we're here in Toronto. I'm from Peterborough. Cormac is from Ireland. Whereabouts in Ireland?
Dublin.
In Dublin?
Yeah.
Dublin,
Ireland.
Very lovely. And so I have to confess before we even get started that I'm feeling a little starstruck.
Oh.
And you'll see why. I wanted to introduce you properly first, and then explain what made this happen. What brought me to ask you to do this chat. So introducing you, you are the managing director of ABCD Europe, Asset-Based Community Development Europe. It is so great that ABCD is all over Europe. You're based in Ireland, and you're a faculty member of ABCD Institute in Chicago, which is phenomenal. Do you do that over the internet, or do you go there over the internet?
We're really just an informal motley group, so it sounds more impressive than it actually is.
It's impressive. John McKnight is affiliated there, so that's pretty cool. Yeah. I was going to say you're a student and a protege, I would say, of John McKnight. And I'll tell you my story about John McKnight in a minute. But your ambition is to support the proliferation of inclusive, bottom-up, community-driven change. I got this all from your website, by the way. And you aim to achieve this by supporting communities and organizations to create the conditions where any neighborhood can identify, connect, and mobilize its assets to benefit the whole community. This is like, oh, I love this so much. And your motto when it comes to community building, well done is better than well said.
Ben Franklin.
Let's not just talk about it, eh? Let's do something. Yeah. And one of the quotes that you say all the time is focus on what's strong, not what's wrong. And that has great meaning to me. I've never voiced it in those words exactly, but that's what drives me. The quote that brought us here today is, you don't prescribe or program community. You contribute to it and invite it in. Is that your quote?
Yeah.
So I read that. You posted that on Facebook. I read it. I thought, that is cool. I went on, and it was like, shh, gotta go back. Went back. I probably did that 5 or 6, 7, 10 times. It just bubbled something up in me because of the things that we're going through right now. So I'd love to talk about what it is that we're going through. And so can I just tell my little story? First of all, I wanted to tell you about my relationship with John McKnight. He doesn't know I have a relationship with him, by the way. I'm sure he doesn't. But that man absolutely, radically, irrevocably changed my life in 1989. So in 1989, our daughter was 4. Oh, and by the way, I spoke with my daughter, and she said it's okay for me to tell this story about her. She was 4 years old, and well, actually, she was 5 years old, I guess. And I was invited by an agency person in Peterborough to go to this thing in Toronto. And off I went. I didn't know. I was in a very bad place at that time, and he says, come on with me. We'll get out of town for a while. And we went to this thing. So there's John McKnight in a church. There's all these people in the church. He's standing up at the front on the dais, and he's talking to all these people. The place was packed. I'm sitting in the front row, and it was like, Linda. Of course, he didn't know me. He didn't say my name or anything like that, but I felt like he was pointing his finger at me and saying, Linda, if you don't get this, your daughter Laura is going to have a terrible, terrible life. And he talked about strong, healthy community. He talked about all people having gifts and strengths and capacities, and everybody has something to contribute, and every community will only be strong when everybody is contributing. And I went away from that. I'm driving home. It was like I can still remember being in the car, and I was just in tears. It was like, oh my gosh, the last meeting we had around our daughter was like a few days or a week or something before. There were like 20 people around the table, and not one of them except me was unpaid. Everybody was paid to be there. They were the only people who wanted to say something, and it was all negative. It was all based on all the brokenness in her, right? So she lives with multiple disabilities. She has an intellectual, developmental, physical, mental health. She has autism. She's got all these labels. We don't think of her that way. After John McKnight, he changed my DNA that day. See, my DNA was absolutely radically changed, and everything that I've done ever since 1989, everything, my volunteer work, all the various different jobs, everything that I've done with my daughter, even with my son. Hats off to Paradigm Pictures, by the way, my son Rob. Everything that I've done has always been based on that, what he taught me that day. You have to start looking at Laura in a very different way. And so I saw this, and what we're dealing with right now is trying to find support people who get this idea that they're not trying. I don't want them to come in and fix her brokenness. Her brokenness isn't brokenness. She just is who she is. And we love her. So come in and help her to define the life that she wants to design for herself, and then help her to live that life. There's so many people who don't get this idea that people with disabilities are not broken. They're just differently abled, or they just have different needs, and our job is to support them in living into their best life. And they have gifts and strengths and capacities that they need to contribute, and our community will not be strong until they do.
That's right.
So I would love for you to talk about this quote and how it sort of relates to the community that I'm interested in, who will be watching this little talk.
Sure. Yeah, great. Well, the first thing to say, Linda, is that 1989 was the year, in political terms, the wall came down.
Oh, really?
The Berlin Wall.
Oh, really? Really?
Yeah.
I didn't know that.
So
that's
an interesting coincidence.
Yeah, really. That's so good.
So as you were sharing your journey and Laura's journey and your kind of interface or inflection point with John, the image of the wall was really strong in my mind. And I use that image a lot to try to explain what we're meaning and what we're not meaning. Because, of course, with something simple, it's very, very easy to not quite understand or not quite get the nuance of it. And I don't think that's anybody's fault. It's just, I think asset-based community development is something that gets you. You don't get it. So your story is one of being got.
Yeah. Oh, did I ever get got?
So, yeah, because you say John spoke to you, he evoked something from you, almost like an ancient wisdom that we've forgotten, and it's like, wake up, Linda.
Yeah. I felt that.
And I think a lot of people have that experience, right? So the idea of the wall is very much that idea, and I think of it a lot with my own young kids. It runs through so much in good and bad ways. So let's just use that for a second, okay? So most young kids hear about the wall for the very first time in the nursery rhyme Humpty Dumpty.
Oh, right.
Okay?
Yeah, right.
And I think it's a really powerful metaphor to use, because in a sense you've got this person called Humpty Dumpty, and they're seen to be vulnerable, they're seen to be fragile, they're seen to be at risk, or whatever the language would be. So they're on the edge of this wall. Okay, and the whole story is, well, we all know how it goes, right? It doesn't end well. Humpty falls off, and all of the king's horses and all of the king's men, and read for that, the institutional world, can't put Humpty back together again. And I wonder how many people actually stop and really appreciate the wisdom of that nursery rhyme. It's like it's encoded, ABCD is right there. It's wake up. Do you not see it?
Is that in your book?
Yes, not in that one.
Not in this one. I just want to show this.
In another book which is coming out soon. And so I think what a lot of people who are sweet on the idea of building community and inclusion do is they spend all of their time on the king's horses and king's men's side of the wall trying to reform the system. So maybe if we just took ABCD and we use that as a lens through which to reform our way of fixing people, we might be better at fixing. So instead of understanding that the actual message is stop fixing, anything is better than that. You know, there's Alec Mansky's new book, which I'd commend, around the power of disability. And Al
such a great
says,
guy.
absolutely, Al says, what I learned as a father was that my daughter didn't need to be fixed. She needed a home for her difference.
Yes.
Don't we all?
What a beautiful way to put it.
So, so then, and I bet you could engage a 3-year-old in this conversation. So you say, okay, we want to distract people from the reform question. You know, how can we get the king's horses and king's men to be better? And we want to have a different conversation. And the different conversation is, what would happen if Humpty fell on the other side? So, and you can't see the other side because there's a wall. So we've got people obsessing about, you know, performance anxiety of the king's horses and king's men. We've got a wall. We've got Humpty is about to fall. So you can see why people don't get this. Because everything is pointing us in the direction of rescue, of fix, of advise, of counsel, of service.
Yeah.
And so the stakes are really high. And it takes courage, whereas I think a lot of people are trying to get to ABCD through technical solutions. So in a sense, they're trying to prescribe or program, you know, Humpty Dumpty. They're saying, well, maybe if we just kind of rode into town from this angle, things would be better, or if we tried it this way, things would be better. But the same impulse to fix and program is what's driving the change effort. And I think that's part of the problem with giving something a name, like calling ABCD, ABCD.
Yeah.
Because immediately it starts to become something. It starts, you know, we get the hardening of the categories instead of the archeries, so it becomes a model. And we're seeing this even in Canada, and I keep saying it to certain people, stop calling it a model, because what will happen is people will start thinking of it like that, as something rigid and fixed that you do to people. And I think the reason people call it a model is because they're desperate for people to take the approach seriously. And so they think, well, what do I need to say to get the king to listen to me?
That's the language that people in the business use.
Yeah, absolutely.
I consider it more like a mindset. To me, it's a mindset. I should say that you know, back our daughter is almost 36 years old now, and back in the early days, we were told that she wouldn't walk, wouldn't talk, wouldn't be able to make decisions for herself, would likely not have any friends, wouldn't go very far in school. She wouldn't be able to read, certainly. She wouldn't be able to comprehend anything. I mean, we're told all these things, and that was in the early years. Then when she was leaving high school, this one organization did an assessment on her. They assessed 240 things, and of the 240 things, she was broken in 230 of them. So they focused on, you know, we've got to fix all of these 230 things. And I'm going, you know what? I just think there's 10 things here that she does really, really well. And I think that if we build on those things, so that's what they couldn't understand that. So we ended up getting our daughter away from all agencies, and she's living her own life. So she, when she was very young, when she was 10 years old, she said, I want to live in an apartment. She'd never seen an apartment. I don't even know how she knew what an apartment was. Yeah. She was just starting to talk. And she said, I want to live in an apartment. So we said, okay, so how do we ever make that happen? How's that going to work? And she said, I want to be a teacher. She said that from really, really young. I want to be a teacher. Okay, so how do we make that happen? Okay, let's work on that. So today, she's living in her own apartment on her own. She has a paying job. She is very involved with her friends. She has friends with disabilities, without disabilities. She directs her own life. She's got an army of people who support her, but she tells them how she wants to be supported and when she wants to be supported. And that, I think, has come from this mindset of she's not broken.
Yeah.
She just, this is what she wants to do. How do we make that happen?
Absolutely. And that's the other side of the wall. So what you've just shared there is the story about what can happen. You know, this idea that there's a nest and there's hatchers and there's catchers on the other side, that they can do things that simply can't be done on the institutional side. It's not that doesn't make the institution bad, it just means it's limited. And no matter what we try to do with the institution, it's just not in its nature to care. It's not in its nature to be a community. So it can't even be a bad community. Even when it tries to be a proxy for community, it tends to do more harm than good. And I think that's the hardest part, is to kind of quiet that down and try to, turn up the voices that you've just, in a way modeled. So for me, ABCD is a description of what people do in normal, uncontracted life, normal community life, when they're effective together. So, as you say, it's a way of being, it's a way of thinking, and it's kind of curious, because we'll say, a throwaway comment like communities care and institutions can't. And that's not a commentary on the people who work within the institutional world. So that's not an attempt to demean the professional. In fact, it's a very good way of making sure that professionals don't burn out. So
right, because they do.
They do, regularly. You
All
look
the
at the
time.
statistics in Canada of burnout in the health professions, the education professions, and juvenile justice. Not to mention intellectual disability, or whatever the label might be, because they're all labels. And then you begin to go, hang on a second here. There are two kinds of people incarcerated within these systems. One are the people called the clients, and the other are the people called the professionals.
Right.
And there's very little liberty or freedom or democracy going on either side of that. So if we say, okay, well, there is a role for the professional world, and if we figure that out, what we can do is make sure that the people who serve in that world don't burn out. Then the question is, okay, beyond the limits of that, what's the role for community? And our argument all along, and I mean ours and yours and mine and others that are in this conversation, is, well, the primary job of a neighbour is to be in relationship with other neighbours. So in Canada, First Nations people will often greet you with all of my relations, which is to say, every relationship I have, past, present, and future, with people, with the land, with the culture, with the economy, and with the spirit world, I greet you with now. That's pretty awesome, right?
That is, isn't it?
And that's a very nice encapsulation of what we mean by being a near neighbour. And you take that near neighbour idea on the other side of the wall, and you're saying to Humpty Dumpty, you got a choice right now. You can literally go back this way, or you can go forward that way. And here's what's going to happen either side of that, momentum or that movement. It doesn't end so well here. And there's no guarantees it's going to be perfect on this side. But we think with you, we can build a nest. We think with you, we can hatch your gifts and ours. And we think within that, you can have a life. And actually, we're confident enough in ourselves that we know if there's stuff you need over the other side of the wall, or we need, we can dip into that too. But we're choosing to live in a culture and live in a story that says those things are supplementary to the hatching and the catching.
Wow.
They're not a replacement.
Hatching and catching. Love that.
They're supplementary to it. And actually then saying, and this is a really critical piece, then saying to the professional world, look, the only way that people are going to buy this story, because it's a pretty implausible story, is if you practice what I would term, and it's a technical term, subsidiarity.
I haven't heard that word before.
It's not a word that's used a lot in this space, I think, and it's a word that I've kind of thrown in intentionally. Mm-hmm. So now we're having the conversation with the king, queen, king's horses, king's men, women, gender fluid, so it's inclusive. And we're saying to them, okay, so there's this concept called subsidiarity, which most people do not really think about or even know about. But it says that no bigger entity will do that which a smaller entity can do, even if they don't do it as well.
That is so good. That is exactly what you talk about all the time.
So that's actually enshrined in a lot of subsidiarity. Okay. So actually, if you look at a lot of state and province federal law, there will be either explicitly or implicitly this concept of subsidiarity, which is a way of guarding against institutional overreach. So we now know the king, good or bad, whatever their motivations may be, wants to be sovereign, right? That's their impulse, right? To rule over their domain, okay? And one of the great ways of doing that, even if you're not democratic, if you want to be totalitarian, is kill them with kindness. It's a great way to oppress people. And we know the king's horses and king's men are going to do what they're told, and they want to be helpful. So how do you actually have a conversation whereby you say, okay, if your impulse is to want to be useful, to be helpful, to have your expertise used, stop trying to fix. Stop trying to help. Now, I think what has happened is some of what people hear when they hear ABCD is they hear community folks like you and me maybe saying to the professional world, get off the road. We're coming through, And I think that's a great pity. Yeah. Because actually what would be a little bit easier to palate, I think, if I was thinking about this from a professional perspective, is to say, no, we're not saying get off the road, we're saying get back in your own lane.
Yeah, oh, that's good.
Okay, so part of your story was all these people swerving into your lane as mother, your lane as, as advocate, your lane as a neighbor, your lane as, the community person in the conversation with your daughter and your family. And this constant, like, here's 240 kind of swerves into your side door, saying, not alone is she not good enough, but you're not good enough, and here's an overwhelming business case for you. 240 reasons why you should just put everybody in the car and drive on over to our lane.
It just
we'll
makes
take
me
it from here. But the critical thing, it seems to me, is if we say to those people, get off the road, and it's an act of violence or it's an act of anger in that sense, albeit very validly based.
Which I've done.
Haven't we all? And so it doesn't work.
No.
And in fact, sometimes what it can do is it can actually backfire. Mm-hmm. Right? So then it's how do we have this conversation, which isn't a collusion. We're not playing into the hands of the system. We're not pretending there aren't power issues in the relationship. But we're trying to change the conversation. And I think it's a conversation about get back in your lane. There's stuff you can do at this side of the wall. There's stuff we can do on the wall. There's stuff we can do over here. But actually, if we start over there or on the wall, the stuff over here will always be overshadowed. It will always be rendered invisible or irrelevant or inadequate.
It reminds me of where I grew up in Peterborough. We grew up in a neighborhood where there were, I'm guessing now, anybody from the old neighborhood who sees this will say, why don't you know that number, Linda? But there's 40 houses that were built as a cooperative. Okay. So all the dads went and built all the houses for all the families to move into. And we were like one big happy family. And it was a way of growing up where almost every parent was a parent to all the, there were hundreds of kids in this neighborhood. I'm telling you, everybody had so many kids back then, but everybody knew one another. Everybody was all the kids were disciplined to listen to all of the adults. They respected all of the adults, so they were all like parents. When somebody needed something, there was always somebody there to give them what they needed. When somebody wanted to give something, there was always somebody there to take it. There was such a community feeling there. To this day, so most of the people, I think there's only one person that's still living there that was there originally back in the 50s when I grew up. And even now to this day, us kids from that neighborhood are still connected. Even though we don't see each other all the time, when we see one another, it's like family. And everybody is non-judgmental. They accept everybody for who they are. And it's just the way, like, I want that for my kids. I want that for all of society. What has happened? I think that sense of community has kind of disappeared, that giving and taking, that acknowledgement of people for who they really are, not the face that they put on. And you know, we've gone into this new age now where it's all about technology and whatever, and we've kind of lost that. And I think that the ABCD mindset for me is about getting back to that place where you see people for who they really are. It's a reciprocity thing that's going on, right? There's this back and forth thing, but I feel like people, you know, when you start talking to them about it, it's like they've lost that memory of what it used to be like. I don't know.
Yeah.
How can we find it again? This is my big question for you today, is how do we find this, and how do we like proliferate? Because I really want people who have been sort of set on the margins to be able to benefit from this way of thinking and doing. It's not just about thinking, right? It's about doing.
Yeah. My own sense of it is that the invitation is more about inviting people to figure out how to build the ties that bind in our present reality, inspired by all accounts by memories of the past. So there is that element of inviting people to remember in the two senses of the term, right? One is reforming membership groups and associational life, and the other is recall. But I think there's a real danger in saying, or it would be hard, I think, might be a more balanced way of putting it. It would be very hard to commend to people the idea that we should all go back to the way it was in the past, and I don't think that's what you're saying.
No.
So it's very much about saying that the reasons, perhaps, that it was easier to do what happened back then was because there was a whole range of things that were in play and weren't in play, which made it so. So, you know, it was more likely that people would consider that their good life was in their relationships, less in money or, you know, in work or whatever. That's a harder argument to win these days. But it's even interesting to say, but our lives changed from those days, and we all moved and we went to different places. And of course, we maintain the relationships now. But then the question becomes, well, did all of those kids go off and go into neighborhoods and do what they did when they were kids in those neighborhoods? And it starts to get a little bit more complex. So, you know, if we're going to move past family reunions and, you know, community get-togethers and cooperative reminiscences and really move into change, we've got to accept the world as it is right now.
Darn.
And that's not quite the same as saying, and, you know, the digital world is taking over, and, you know, robots are going to take our jobs. And I think it's about making better, more quality distinctions around technology, and enabling people actually not to feel like they're a victim to the times. I wonder, you know, I hear a lot of people talk about popular culture, and I'm hesitant to say it out loud, but I keep thinking to myself, is what people mainly describe as popular culture not the absence of culture? You know, I mean, in the sense that what you were describing, and this is the critical piece, your lived experience as a child was that you had a way. It wasn't just your family, it wasn't just you as, you know, I did it my way. It was that there was a culture that called kindness forth, that called a sense of community forth, that probably enabled you to resolve conflicts and do all kinds of crazy things. You weren't all purer than pure. There were sins and there were fornications and there were all kinds of things. And there were rumors, even if it didn't happen, you know. So there was all of that stuff going on. And some people, and there were people who maybe didn't fit in also. And who breathed a sigh of relief when they got out of that community because they felt it was like living in a closet, you know.
Could be.
And
I can't imagine that, but
no,
could be.
but it's not implausible.
Yeah.
You know, that maybe some people didn't actually feel that their difference had a home, you know. And so I think for all kinds of reasons, it's a curious time we live in. So many people who have been maybe exiled from their communities because they were different have actually formed into new communities of difference.
Yeah.
And they're trying to have a voice. I think there are people online who have been exiled from, I suppose, what I would call on land. I always smile because I keep saying to my sons, don't talk about offline and online because it denigrates what's real and it lifts up what's digital and pixelated. So true. And so I respect what happens online. I respect the connections, but I ask you to respect what happens on land as well. So could we meet in the middle?
Right.
And my question constantly is, how do we migrate our conversations that happen online to on land? And how do we augment the conversations that happen on land, online, when we can't be together? So we can begin to, and the reason I'm asking these questions is I want to understand how we can build ties that bind in the modern world. Now, the minute I say to my kids, gee, you should have seen it when I was a kid,
back
you know,
in the day.
boom, back in the day. So the rose-tinted glasses go on, the conversation shuts down.
Yeah.
So there's something about that. I mean, a lot of people will say to me as well, why are you emphasizing place so much, you know? Why can't you talk more about communities of issue or communities of affinity? I would say it's not an exclusion of any of these communities, but presumably every single affinity group, every single, you know, community of interest physically touches land somewhere.
Yes, there's a physical place.
And is not so much of the issue that we have around dislocation, like literally dislocation, disembodiment, being not connected to place. We know Greta Thunberg's trying to conscientize us in wonderful ways around being aware of the challenges with how we have tried to live a life of our choosing, but at the expense of our planet and our future, and how you don't get to trade those things off, you know. So I think these are questions that are perennial. They keep recurring in different shapes and forms, and our challenge, our gift, and our curse perhaps at times, is to try to unburden that stress and that strain and say, okay, where is community for you now? And what's that like for you?
Right.
How's that working out?
I think that, you know, it's probably time for us to kind of wrap this up, but my concern these days is for people who have intellectual developmental disabilities who have been pigeonholed, whether they want to be or not. If they want it to be, that's different from being put someplace into a situation where their gifts are not being understood, they're not being recognized, they're not being welcomed or embraced. And there are people who are saying, well, you know, we need people who understand this way of thinking, because we can't, as a community, we can't even envision how a person with significant disability could be participating in community.
Yeah.
How do we do that? How do we get people to think, change their mindset? I want them to change their mindset.
So what we can do is, and again, this slightly goes back to what we were talking about a while ago, is we can look for clues in the past. But rather than inviting people to go back there and recreate it, what we can say is, what was it people did? What functions did people take on, which enabled folks to actually, folks who were vulnerable to not having their gifts received, to having their gifts received? And I think some of what they did very subconsciously, very naturally, and I think part of the challenge now is that we have to be more intentional about it, is that there would have been people there who were really good at asking. You know, I have a friend who has a gift you can't do without it, and here she is. You know, she can sing.
That's what I want.
Yeah, we need askers. You know,
Do we need people that can do this?
I think so.
I think so too. And
Yeah,
if they were, this talks about people going out and asking questions and going out and doing little lists of people's gifts that they have to share, their assets and things like it's an actual exercise.
It is, and people are waiting to be asked.
Yeah.
So if I could say anything that gives hope, it will be on the other side of the wall are people who are waiting to be asked. We just need to know how to do the asking, and that's the critical piece. And it has to be. And this is a difficulty. I mean, because so many of our hearts' yearnings feel like they have to be done today or tomorrow. There's an urgency to them.
I feel that.
And part of what we have to do is go at the speed of trust.
You say that all the time too.
So I know there's a group of parents. I know because I met them last week. We had drinks together. Who really care. They care about cyberbullying. That's their big thing. All of their daughters and their sons are people that I think have their gifts exchanged and received in all kinds of effortless ways. But that's their concern. And it's very interesting to sit down with them and say, you know, if lonely people, if people who are socially isolated in this community don't get in on the act, you're not going to be able to figure out how to deal with your issue.
Yeah.
It's almost like this, the reality starts to dawn that in fact my issue isn't cyberbullying, my issue is that we've got an atomized neighborhood. That's the issue. And that there's no real accountability, that there's an anonymity around how people communicate, that my daughter's editing every single thing she puts into text, that she's got performance anxiety from the minute she wakes up till she, you know, goes to sleep at night. And in so many ways, she's not sharing her gifts either, you know. And so the conversation that I'm thinking about, it's just really interesting to kind of say, what would happen if we didn't wait for the psychologist or the psychiatrist to intervene in the budding crisis, but we actually had a conversation about how we grow community from inside out. If we as a bunch of parents started doing that, but that we didn't make it just about our little issue. And we could start there. I mean, the reason we were having the conversation is we all share in common the concern around cyberbullying, but it's how do you actually open that out and make that, you know, it's almost like the change question isn't cyberbullying, or it isn't disability, or it isn't inclusion. The change question is how do we make the neighborhood the primary unit of change? And by the way, I'm asking you to include me, my daughter, and yourself.
Right.
You know, so it becomes a different invitation.
Wow. So to wrap this up, which I don't want to do, but I know we have to, I want to think a whole lot more about Humpty Dumpty. Oh my gosh, that analogy is just brilliant. You've got that written down somewhere, I hope. I think that what I'm really taking away from this is what I'm going to be doing as a result of this conversation is I'm going to be asking. I'm going to be asking more. I'm going to be helping other people to ask. So whatever it is that you want, you're not going to necessarily have somebody coming up and giving it to you. You've got to ask. And so I'm going to do that. I want people to go to your nurturedevelopment.org, and I want them to see about some of the amazing things that you're doing all over the world. It is phenomenal. I think if we could just have these little seeds planted all over the world, eventually they're going to grow, and it's going to be this amazing global community. And I just want to thank you so much for the work that you do, for this conversation, and I hope that we can have more conversations going forward.
I'd love that.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.